And let me first of all thank the Paper in Motion work group and especially Jose Maria Perez Fernandez for the invitation to this conference. I would have liked very much to stay at the University of Granada. Someone who works in Central Europe gets closer to the full European dimensions of paper in motion when coming to Spain or other Mediterranean countries with their links to Arab paper makers and to the history of paper before print. But please allow me to start with some personal remarks. I guess I'm the only person in this conference who is not a specialist in early modern history, but in his main job, a journalist. I think we all have an individual angle of incidence or a special perspective through and in which we perceive the ongoing changes, the transformations of large parts of traditional paper-based cultural spheres and routines in everyday life. My interest in the history of paper has something to do with the experience of my generation. I was born in the mid-50s of the last century, grew up and was educated in a world of books, newspapers, radio, and TV stations. There was no internet then, and I wrote even my PhD about a German writer of the 18th century who, by the way, was for some months the editor of the most important newspaper in Berlin on a typewriter with some copies on standard paper at the end, excerpting quotations on small filing cards. Then, a few years later, in the decades from the late 80s until 2020, my whole professional life as editor in a German daily newspaper and part-time teacher at universities and writer of books and essays was embedded in the accelerating and expanding process which some people call the rise of digital age. The formula of my generation is, more or less, first half totally analog, second half more and more digital. Experiencing the transformation of one's own workshop place, more and more digital routines in writing, revising texts, designing and producing the single newspaper page, the Monday to Friday or weekend edition of the newspaper. The point I want to make is I wasn't aware of the importance of paper when I lived the first half of my life. I didn't reflect on it, I took it for granted. A friend of mine, a curator in the Berlin Museum of Technology, told me a nice anecdote from the rare weeks without full lockdown when school classes visited the computer section of his museum. Looking to technical equipment from recent past in technology is like wandering through a museum of archaeology. In the eyes of 9-year-old children of today, the huge computers from the 20th century look like extincted dinosaurs. One of these young visitors asked a very intelligent question. How, asked he, how did people get into the internet when there were no computers? This is, in my ears, a wonderful example of what we call the ingenious children question. It takes the internet as second nature, as something that was ever and will ever be, as a kind of transcendental sphere, and the computers are only the tools to get access to this sphere. Of course, this does not describe the reality of the internet, but a state of mind in which it is taken for granted. It was my state of mind towards paper at the end of the first half of my life. I had studied history of literature and cultural history, but never visited a seminar on paper history. I was very much interested in book history, But even book history was separated from paper history. And in the media theories, there was only one dynamic force, the printing press. This state of mind, paper as second nature, taken for granted and therefore not a subject to reflect on, changed, in my case, with the changes in my office. It was obvious that the reason for the changing demands, the new equipments and tools, and the new routines in producing the newspaper was not that the good old dynamic force, the printing press, had lost its power. On the contrary, its power of reproducing more and more copies in less and less time was unbroken. The reason was the rapid change in the technological infrastructure of news circulation. Changes in time and space managing media. Of course, we knew the history of the telegraph, the history of radio and TV, the live transmissions. But there had been not only the rivalry between the so-called print media and these neighbors, but something like a peaceful coexistence within this rivalry. We had a wrong concept of our own medium, daily newspaper, by calling it print medium, and the ensemble of newspapers, the press. It was not only print, it was paper as well, and what circulated was paper. We had to learn that you can detach the so-called print medium newspaper from the press and from paper. You don't need a tool of physical reproduction of the newspaper if you have a tool to let the newspaper circulate on a new carrier medium, which is less a physical object as paper. You don't need two things with the new infrastructure of circulation, the printing press and paper. In the beginning, paper history was not very present in our debates on the transformation of printed newspapers in their digital website-based followers. One of the slogans was "from print to digital." I knew a little bit about the history of the printing press, but nearly nothing from the history of paper. Now, parallel to the accelerating changes in my office, I consulted the experts of paper history in order to understand the process I was part of. It was a process of transformation, printed newspapers and paper routines from the first half of my life. I learned that the prehistory of digitalization can be found in the history of paper itself. First, I learned something about the origins of paper, its production, and so on. Enough to understand that printing press and paper are not twins, that paper is much more than printed paper. Then that the whole concept of printing press as dynamic force in paper as the passive element combined with male-female associations was wrong. There was much activity around paper without print and very much power in its existence in more and more symbioses and routines in the modern world. Paper turned out to be an underestimated element within cultural history. That was the first step. And the second was to learn that there were underestimated regions within the paper history as discipline as well. For a long time, the story of paper circulation was told as the circulation of paper products, books, newspapers, letters. I am now fascinated by recent studies on the missing link between paper production and circulation of, for example, newspapers. This underestimated element is the paper trade. Some months ago, I read a very dense German case study on the paper market in Amsterdam in the 18th century and learned that knowledge about the European paper trade is indispensable for the understanding of what is called the material and semiotic mobility of paper in the invitation and title of your conference. Not being a specialist in early modern history myself, I need the paper history in pre-modern Europe to understand the birth and rise of my medium, the daily newspaper. So, in my point of view, the material and semiotic mobility of paper is a very good answer to the question, what is a printed newspaper? Come to my second point. Let's start with mobility, which means paper trade and circulation of paper as carrier medium of letters, broadsheets, almanacs, or playing cards. Mobility emphasizes one of the two basic qualities of paper seen from the perspective of media history. It is a medium of circulation in space on a synchronic scale and a storage medium in diachronic perspective and various degrees. Paper revolution and communications revolution are twins. The paper revolution from the 14th century on included not only more production and more consumption, but most of all the display of various formats and functions of paper. What seemed to be its passive character in comparison with the printing press turned out to be its multifunctionalism. It is from the beginning not fixed to one purpose. It is a master medium of functional differentiation, which is one of the favorite terms in Max Weberian theories of modernity. The first product of Gutenberg's printing press was not the heavy, precious Bible, but a bundle of indulgences. Paper in its various symbioses covers a wide field from the ephemeral to the durable. The concept of communications revolution was developed in order to correct the common view of industrial revolution, focused on the material dimension in factories and mines, the construction of canals and roads, of steamships and railway trains. The concept of communications revolution did not only add the telegraph, the submarine cables, the telephone, and so on. It was based on the thesis that the communications revolution was a distinct development with its own separate phenomena and consequences. In other words, the Industrial Revolution was not only industrial. The epochal changes covered with this term had to be seen in a wider range, including communication as a distinct sphere. Communication tools had to be considered as autonomous agents of change. Didn't, for example, predate the postal system in England, the Industrial Revolution. The history of acceleration, of raising mobility did not start with the Industrial Revolution. It is deeply rooted in the history of early modern Europe. In this respect, I follow Wolfgang Behringer, who in various studies investigated the formation of a fixed network of transcontinental postal routes in Europe, and draw the conclusion that the evolution of this Central European communications infrastructure forces us to reconsider the idea of an essentially static pre-modern age not gripped by an acceleration imperative until the so-called Sattelzeit period of the 18th century. Talking about the mobility of paper means talk about its being part of and at the same time active agent in the communications revolution. In my view, the semiotic and the material aspect in the mobility of paper belong together, provided that you accept an understanding of communication which is not restricted to the 20th and 21st century. After the linguistic turn in the philosophy of the 20th century and the parallel changes in everyday language, the term communication is focused on the exchange of signs by spoken language, written language, or any other codes. In German, English, and French, this is a narrowing of a wider spectrum of meanings in the late 17th, the 18th, and 19th century. Communication included the media of transport, canals, streets, roads, the tools of open up space. The Dictionnaire of the Académie Française of 1694 remarks under communication, le détroit de Gibraltar fait la communication de l'océan et de la Méditerranée. In 19th century France, les moyens de communication, like steamship traffic and railways, were seen as risk factors for the prevention of cholera epidemics. This older concept of communication was, of course, not exclusively centered on spatial and transport aspects. It did include the exchange of signs in spoken and written language as well. So it is an ideal background for the reflection on the close neighborship between paper revolution and communications revolution. So I finally reach the title of this speech, The Birth of the Newspaper. It is generally accepted that the first printed newspaper was the Relation, published in autumn 1605 in Strasbourg at the periphery of the Holy Roman Empire by Johann Carolus, who had bought a printing office 1 year ago. The office was expensive. He had to finance the credit. His project was a carefully designed and well-prepared business idea. To transform the handwritten newspapers he copied and sold for years in print. He was a scribe and he was a printer. The idea was to integrate the former into the latter. Instead of telling once more the story of Johann Carolus, I will try to analyze his idea and its consequences with a set of categories established in the early 20th century to define the term newspaper. It had to be published, universal, periodical, and topical. I call this a magic square because it's more than an addition of attributes. It is a set of interdependent elements working together in the rise of the new medium, the newspaper. It had to be published. That meant this is not a private, exclusive medium, it is market. The access code is money, which means there is no other exclusion. Of course, it was sold as the handwritten newspapers had been to people who were able to read. But once established, the newspaper could be read aloud, like the Bible, and you could listen to it even if you were illiterate. The idea of transforming handwritten and printed newspapers was the first step to a larger audience by producing more copies than before. Compared to later centuries, these new readers were a very small circle, but the idea was the expansion of publicity, or the other way around, to reduce exclusiveness. Of course, Johann Carolus had not a modern concept of inclusion in mind, but his own financial interests. The more copies you produce, the more customers you need. The whole idea was based on the supposition that there was a demand for news, and that you could test this demand by transforming the handwritten newspaper in print and reducing the price. There was a need. The historians found out that the price of the early printed newspapers was much lower as that of their handwritten forerunners, about 20%. Let's come to the second category, universal. It means a newspaper is not what we nowadays call special interest. It's open for lots of material from different spheres, military, politics, economy, law. Of course, there is a link between public character and universal content, and universal is only the inherent potentiality of the newspaper, its horizon, which could be, of course, be reduced by restrictions, the most important being censorship. The following categories, both temporal, demanding that a newspaper has to be periodical and topical, belong closely together. They form the driving force which fuels the rise of the new medium. Periodical means the time structure of a non-ending series in a definite frequency. Paper trade was important for the continuity of paper supply in the printing office of Johann Carolus. Supply of news was a second precondition for the production of a periodical newspaper, whether handwritten or printed. This supply was guaranteed by the postal system and the postal routes. After the Reichspost, the imperial post was established in the late 16th century. Strasbourg had a post office and was connected to the great postal routes Rome, Venice, Basel, Augsburg, direction Antwerp. The communication network of the postal system was the important infrastructure for the mobility of paper, the circulation of news written on paper. And as paper became the dominant medium of written communication, paper and the postal system formed an alliance which was just as epochal as that between paper and the printing press. The printing press of Johann Carolus stood in Strasbourg, but his market was not confined to the city itself. He had to distribute the printed newspapers, and for this distribution, again, the postal system was indispensable. Paper's association with the postal system as carrier medium for newspapers was momentous, as its acceleration of reproduction on the printing press was long-lasting. A defining element of the modern world crystallized here. Mail delivery day became a recurring interlude in the temporal continuum of everyday life, not to mention a cardinal motif in literature. Topicality in the era of Johannes Carolus is bound to the mobility of paper within the infrastructure of the postal system. Topical means latest news. Short time span between the incident in time and space the news is about and the moment of reading the newspaper. Latest news in the time of Johann Carolus was defined by the weekly rhythm of arriving news. Short time span is relative. Weekly didn't mean not daily, like nowadays. Relation was quoted by its readers as gedruckte wochentliche Ordinary Zeitung. Both elements, weekly and ordinary, were references to the postal system signal of topicality of latest news. Johann Carolus was not a journalist, but he had already a deadline. When he transformed incoming news, most of them via Augsburg, into printed newspaper. With respect to the distribution of his product, he had to produce the relation in the short time span between the arrival of the post rider and its departure. When the square of publicity, universality, periodicity, and topicality was coined in early 20th century, everybody knew that the media of transport and news circulation had changed in the age of telegraph, railway, and submarine intercontinental cables. Paper, the carrier medium, was not part of the square, it was presupposed. Nobody had in mind that the followers of the old postal system, the media of news circulation, its former ally, could turn out to be the gravediggers of the printed newspaper. In the last years in my office, noticing the changes in my job as editor, I asked myself, since the old magic square of printed newspaper doesn't mention paper, and since we experience the real detachment of the newspaper from paper, couldn't it be interesting to reflect on the digital formats from the perspective of the old square? My answer was yes, but this is another story. Now I return to my version of the birth of newspaper. The English word newspaper is a tribute to the carrier medium. The French journal emphasizes the periodicity. The German word Zeitung is connected to Zeit, which means time, and an interesting case because the word Zeitung is much older than the medium. Zeitung was first of all a single message, mostly oral. In Martin Luther and in Fischart, a writer who was published in Strasbourg in the 16th century, you can find Zeitung in this older sense, and there were connections to the Bible, especially to the New Testament and the Gospels as new messages, Botschaften of God. The messenger became part of the title conventions of newspapers as the postreiser. And then, especially in 18th century England, you have lots of stars as newspaper titles. The Morning Star, the Evening Star, and of course, the Sun. I mention this because it leads me back to early modern Europe, where the periodicity of newspapers and the postal system is still close to the time of the Christian calendar, the periodicity of religious rituals. That is what the philosopher Hegel had in mind when he said in 1804, the newspaper is a kind of secular morning prayer. That was before Hegel worked for 1.5 years as a newspaper editor in Bamberg. The very title, Relation, which Johann Carolus chose for his newspaper, was a signal, a promise of secular news in the context of the culture of the factual. But of course, pharma and rumor were part of the early newspapers. In the title convention of newspapers, you find the universal, the topical, the periodical element, and the publicity. And this publicity is part of the widespread title element, press. Perhaps Hegel is right, and newspapers around 1800 were either a parallel phenomenon to religious periodicity or a part of its heritage. But in this analogy, there is a difference. Periodical news is a powerful agent of forming the modern self. The English historian C. John Somerville developed the thesis that consuming periodical news, first weekly, then daily, produced or co-produced a shift of attitude in perceiving the world. What had been stable, solid, guaranteed by worldly and heavenly powers became a changing world in enduring metamorphosis. This thought emphasizes the temporal inherent in the magical square, especially in periodicity and topicality, the close relationship between newspaper and the present day, the present as such as opposed to the past as a source of tradition, stability, legitimacy. But in the English language, as in German and French, there is an older dimension in the word present, Gegenwart, Présence. This is the spatial dimension. The presence of someone is that he is present, that he is here. In your presence, my heart beats loudest, says the letter writer in epistolary novels. Only in modern times, the temporal meaning of Gegenwart is in the foreground. I would like to underline this spatial element in my visit to the printing office of Johann Carolus in early 17th century. Most of the avise he dealt with came from Rome, Venice, Prague, Vienna, and Cologne. We don't know the content of his Relation from 1605 to 1608, but a complete copy of the annual set 1609 was handed down to our present. The mobility of paper, the news circulation transformed in printed newspaper with more and more copies, and the rhythm of the postal system created a new perception of the non-domestic foreign world. The early newspapers offered news from abroad, mostly inner European news, only later, first in England, with a conflict between Crown and Parliament, the domestic news grew more and more important. The universality of newspapers is part of the spatial dimension. Caspar Stieler, one of the early observers of the new medium, writes in his chapter Von dem Stoff oder sogenannten Materie der Zeitung, the subjects of newspaper at the end of the 17th century, this matter, the substance of newspapers is alles, was in der Welt vorgeht, all what happens in the world. And 1 century later, the historian philolog August von Schlözer, one of the pioneers of statistics, wrote in his eloge on newspaper, Zeitungen. Mit einem Gefühl von Ehrfurcht schreibe ich dieses Wort nieder. Zeitungen sind eines der großen Kulturmittel, durch die wir Europäer geworden sind. Newspapers, with a feeling of awe, I write down this word. Newspapers are one of the great cultural means which made us Europeans. Written on 4th of September, Johann Carolus received in autumn 1609 news from Venice, saying that the authorities had honored the Signor Galilei from Florence, professor of mathematics at Padua, and raised his provision by 100 crowns a year because he had, through assiduous study, invented an instrument for the eye through which one can see places which are 30 miles away. Carolus printed the news in the 37th edition of his Relation in 1609. On August 21, 1609, Galileo Galilei had presented his telescope on the Campanile of San Marco before an audience of senators from Venice. The writer of the news didn't know the word telescope, nor its most prominent purpose. In the springtime of the following year, Galileo Galilei studied the surface of the moon, discovered the 4 moons of Jupiter, observed the Saturn and the phases of the Venus. Still in 1610, he published his Sidereus Nuncius in Venice. I know that analogies are forbidden in serious history writing, but I'm convinced that not by chance the first newspapers and the first telescopes are close neighbors. Both had the messenger in their title. The telescope brought news from heaven, the newspaper from the world. In a fascinating essay, the philosopher Hans Blumenberg has shown that the telescope as instrument of scientific curiositas didn't just explore distant space, but shaped a new way of experiencing time. By making more and more invisible objects visible, the object of curiosity was the invisible not yet discovered. The firm and steady connection between cosmos, eternity, and unchanged stability was loosened, undermined by the unrest of the not yet. There will be news, but you don't know which news. That is exactly the type of dense expectation created by the periodicity of the newspaper. Curiosity in its modern sense. Like the telescope, the newspaper is an instrument which makes visible what happens far away in parts of the world you will never see with your own eyes. Of course, there had ever been tales from travelers. It was the era of European expansion, but now you could observe from week to week what happened in the Catholic Netherlands or on the battlefields of the 30 Years' War if you had a subscription to the Relation, to the Nordischer Mercurius, or to the ordentliche wochentliche Postzeitung. Now I come to the end. One section of this conference is devoted to the role of paper in the process of the codification of emotions in shaping the modern self. Perhaps the most prominent agent in this field is the latter, in any case for historians of 18th century literature, who fill a whole library with books and articles on private letter writing and the epistolary novel. The counterpart of private letter writing and novel reading is newspaper reading. Novel readers in the 18th century are mostly female, newspaper readers male. We saw Johann Carolus in 1605 in Strasbourg, the printer and scribe, having the business idea of producing printed newspapers. Let's switch to England in the late 17th century and early 18th century in order to look at an exemplary newspaper reader in times when the medium was fully established. The Israeli historian Dror Warman, in his fascinating book, Mr. Collier's Letter Records, a study on newspapers and the art of illusion, called the period after the removing of the Licensing Act in 1695 Print 2.0, mobility of paper in high speed. London had between 65 and London had between 65 and 70 printing houses around 1700 and a very good postal system. 8 new newspapers were founded in the first 3 months after the end of pre-publishing censorship. This was the background for the Quid Nunc, what new? A male newspaper reader who entered stage was satirized in The Tatler and The Spectator. He's not so much a figure in the real history of newspaper, perhaps, but a drug-addicted character created as warning example against the excesses of curiosity. Latest news are perishable goods. In the field of metaphors surrounding the quid nunc, the news market is a neighbor of the flower and fruit market. He is on his way in coffee houses and streets, always on the hunt for latest news from foreign countries. The quid nunc knows much more about a quarrel far away in the continent than about his own family. This was an important aspect. The rise of the newspaper was fueled by the conflicts on the continent and in Great Britain as well. Curiosity was not an abstract need for news, but grew with being part of, say, the 30 Years' War, not on the battlefield or victim of conquest, but as an observer. The universality of the newspaper grew first in England with the growing quota of domestic news. The satires against the quid nunc, who was described as an upholsterer, wanted him to be a reasonable subject, someone who doesn't neglect his business for newspaper reading, and at the same time as somebody who is interested in serious news from his own country and government. The critique of novel reading through characters like Don Quixote made the novel stronger in the first stages of its modern development. The emergence of the quid nunc is a sign of the growing impact of newspapers on everyday life. Sometimes the quid nunc plays the coffeehouse politician on stage. He's a distorted image for the rise of public sphere. This would be the next chapter in looking back to the rise of newspaper in early modern Europe. Thank you.